Well, I want to welcome you to our program today. We have a very special guest. His name is Jason Schumacher. Jason, it's so good to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me, Pastor.
Yeah. Jason is the funeral director of the Bear Funeral Home in Dubuque, Iowa. And so I just really appreciate his coming on the program, because today I want to talk about a specific topic, and that would be the burial of Jesus. And so I can't think of a better person to talk about the burial of Jesus than a funeral director. But before we get into that, Jason, I just want to ask you a little bit about how long have you been working as a funeral director?
I've been in the business about 20 years this year.
20 years.
I started in 1996 is where I switched careers and got into the funeral industry. And I've been in Dubuque since 2000. I was born and raised here, and then came back in 2000 to raise our family, and been working at Bear Funeral Home for the last 11 years.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
Well, certainly I'm always very thankful as somebody who is a pastor of a church, and as we work with people who are bereaved, it's always, the funeral director is always such a comfort and such a big help during that time. Yeah, and so Jason, I just want to thank you for coming and sharing with us and your faith and your knowledge of not just burial practices today, but as we look at some of the ancient burial practices. And I once went to Egypt, and I saw the pyramids, and then I went down into the Valley of the Kings where the pharaohs were buried, and even going into the museum in Cairo, the Egyptian museum, to where, I know that there was burial practices then where they would actually mummify the pharaohs and how their bodies were preserved and so forth. And so, we can go way back, thousands of years, and kind of can learn something about some of the burial practices that were happening, back then. Well, when we think about the burial of Jesus, I'm going to read now from John chapter 19, and this would be verses 38 through 42, and so I'm going to read this, and then I'll have some questions for Jason. Later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now, Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, because he feared the Jews. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with the spices in strips of linen. This was in accordance with Jewish burial customs. At the place where Jesus was laid, or where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no man had ever been laid. Because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. And so Jesus was crucified on a Friday, and so now Jesus, but that whole thing where, it seemed like there was kind of this urgency that as Jesus was dying on the cross, and there were two other people crucified with Jesus, and they broke their legs, the other two, the criminals, to expedite the process. But Jesus, so Jesus died before the two criminals, but why was there such a urgency to get this done? It seems like, well, we got to get this done here pretty quickly.
Right. So we've got to remember that their customs back then, they're still under the old law. So we're working in Jewish, not just customs, but law too. So one of the things that was important back then was that they had to be buried within the day they died. To have somebody around the next day or when the sun came up the next day was considered a sin. And so there was always, any Jewish person that died was supposed to be buried that same day. They would have, and so where we use the myrrh and the oils and the perfumes, and they would use salts and things like that too, those are regular customs. So they would always bathe and clean the body, wrap them in shrouds or gowns, and then you would have a group of pallbearers, so to speak, They would actually carry them to their tomb, or to, most people were in graves. Not everybody was in tombs. But they would have them carried to the grave, and they'd have mourners that went with them, and they'd have musicians leading them and things like that. So it was a regular process every day that anytime somebody died.
So it really was quite a thing that, okay, so that's maybe different than like how we would go through burial today, is that everything had to be done. If a person died, they had to be buried before sundown, and that
Correct.
was a Jewish practice that
Correct.
basically was law for them.
Right, right.
Yeah.
It's a sin if they didn't. So that basically makes it a pretty big law.
And was there any consequences for that, or what? Do you have any idea back then what maybe?
I don't know what the consequences would have been, other than to be ostracized by the rest of the community for breaking the law, or
Okay.
committing a sin. You're disrespecting that body and that soul and God's law,
Yeah.
which
So
did not go over lightly, I'm sure.
So that was a major thing then.
Right,
So yeah,
right.
being ostracized from the community, and to know that you have gone against God's will
Right.
at that point. Yeah. So then, when the person died in the burial, that it wasn't like they just kind of whisked the person off
Oh,
to
no.
be buried somewhere, but that, like you say, well, like the procession, there would be like a procession going through town, or was it just going from the death place to the burial place, or what was that procession all for?
So there was a combination of things going on there. So most folks, the general population would basically have the procession from the place of death, and then they would have a ceremony where they would bathe and clean and use oils and perfumes, and then they would go out to the graveyard or the cemetery, and that's where the burial would take place. Now there are other groups of people, wealthier folks, who would put on more of a show, like a ceremonial, a little more pomp and circumstance, so to speak. So then they might have a little a parade through town or something like that on their way out to the grave or the cemetery or the tomb. But like I said, you basically have your first development of professional funeral service in these times, because you've got the Jewish community. If somebody died on Saturday, couldn't do anything. So on the Sabbath, they're still recognizing the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath. And so what you have is Gentiles going into this profession to basically, they're the ones that do the bathing and the clothing and the getting the mourners lined up and getting the musicians lined up, getting the cemetery ready. So you've got this group of people outside of their, living with them, but outside of their actual community, who are now providing funeral services for folks when they can't do it. So you've got an organized group of people now creating funerals, so to speak, during those times.
And so would that be specific then to somebody dying on the Sabbath?
Well, that's what brings it about pretty much, is the Sabbath everybody shuts down who's in the Jewish community, but the Gentiles can still function, and they still have to obey the laws. And so you've got those folks obviously doing that.
Yeah, because, Jason, share with me a little bit about, what your knowledge would be, because I always kind of thought it was, kind of interesting, if not, kind of peculiar, that you'd actually hear that there were professional
Right.
mourners
Right.
who would, they would come out, and they would be then with, they actually would, dress up in sackcloth, and
Yeah,
they would wail and have music going. And I
Right.
mean, was that just to help them mourn, or what was their function?
I wasn't there. My guess is a lot of it was symbolism more than anything, expressing the sorrow and the pain and the grief and the hurt. But it becomes so much so that it's an ingrained custom now in that culture, that these are things that have to happen as we're taking our loved one from their place where they passed all the way out to the cemetery. These are just normal things that have to occur now. And like I said, some of them get real big and extravagant, and some of them are just simple. I mean, even the poorest folks were responsible to still make all this stuff happen. If you could, it had to be difficult for some of them.
So everybody kind of was buried, or from the time of death, and some of the things that would happen would be buried with dignity, so to speak.
Yeah, so there's an urgency in their expediting, obviously, certain things here, but all of it with respect and dignity. That's the whole part of the thing. I mean, a lot of the fact that you had to be in the ground that day was about dignity and respect for that temple. That the soul has gone home now, but the temple is still here, so we have to respect that. So that's what a lot of that came from.
Well, that is very interesting, because now that brings us to Jesus Well, as we look at, all what led up to this, that he was betrayed by his
Right.
disciples.
Right.
He was arrested by the soldiers. He was basically given a kangaroo trial by the religious authorities, Caiaphas and Annas and the high priests and the Sanhedrin,
Right.
which all had to have been very humiliating for Jesus. But then,
But all part of God's plan too. We got to remember that this has to happen in order for the new covenant to come about. We have to have this happen,
that Jesus had
and
to
He
go
knows
through
that.
this. Yeah,
Yeah, He knows this.
the brutal beating,
Right.
and then being tried with Pilate.
Right.
But then he was paraded all around town,
Yeah.
Jerusalem, carrying his cross.
Right.
And Simon of Cyrene, I think, helped him at one point. But here he is. He's crucified with criminals, and he's mocked by the jeering crowd and the
Right.
soldiers.
Right.
And finally, they determine that he is dead. I mean, they even pierced his side,
Right.
the pericardium, with a sword. Now what? I mean, he's a Jew,
Right.
and he deserves all of the dignity of being a Jew and having, just the things that you're talking
Right.
about with the mourners and with,
Right.
having a decent burial, all within the day.
Right.
But you kind of get the sense that he dies alone. I mean, all these people are around him, but he dies kind of alone. I mean, Jesus was born into this world. He was homeless, basically, just living where people would receive him in.
Right.
And he still seems to kind of have this status of being, became the weakest, the poorest,
Right.
to fulfill what you're saying, God's plan.
Right.
But to go from the cross to the grave now, it almost seems like who's going to take care of him at this point? Who wants to even deal with him at this point?
Right. Right.
Is that kind of that he's just kind of...
Well, his followers have, basically are hiding and denying him at this point. So you've got an entire community ostracized this man and crucified him unjustly, obviously. Yeah, there's not going to be crowds of people wanting to take care of things the way they normally should be. It'd be societal suicide at that point. So you've got a handful of people who are going to help him and take care of him. You've got Joseph, who provides a tomb for him. I mean, these things, they may seem simple, but they're huge if you think about it. What was going on there at that time? A man coming up and saying, I want to take Jesus and I have a tomb for him, my own private personal tomb. Obviously a wealthy man, if he has a private tomb like this, that's huge. So he gets almost buried like a king, whether we realize it or not. Most people were actually buried in the ground. There were as we talked about, there were other tombs over there, but most of them were bigger ones. They'd have 6 to 8 in them, and I know you've seen a bigger one. But to have a private one with 1 or 2 grave spots in it, a very, very elite situation. So when he offers to take him out and make sure that he gets buried with some dignity, that's beautiful. I mean, if you consider everything else, all the peripherals going around in that town right there, it had to be chaotic.
Yeah, so the people who were his family, basically, like Peter, James,
Right.
John, the disciples, they all, who were actually willing to, throughout his ministry, hang out with Jesus, and they
Right.
weren't necessarily ashamed of him. But at the last moment, they abandoned him, they rejected him. It's like he's the black sheep of the family, so to speak, that nobody wants anything to do with.
Right.
But then look who comes out of the woodwork.
Right.
It's like God provides. It's almost like, well, we got to take Jesus down from the cross, but who's going to, are the
no.
dogs going to drag him out of town and bury him like a bone? I mean, is this what's going to happen at this point?
Right.
But you say, well, no. I mean, it looks to me like there's 2 people. There's Nicodemus,
Right. Right.
who was a member of the Sanhedrin, who really, he was a disciple, a follower, but he came to Jesus at night. When we read John 3, all the questions about being reborn. Or what, but then you have Joseph of Arimathea, that he's actually, Joseph and Nicodemus get permission from Pilate to take the body to be buried in Joseph's tomb.
Right.
And as you mentioned that, I did see a tomb in Jerusalem that had many chambers, and in each chamber there were multiple people that could be buried.
Correct.
It looked like a community tomb, but it wasn't like everybody was buried in a tomb.
Right.
Yeah, you said that they were buried in, most of them were just buried in the ground.
Yes, and the ground burials would have been more common. I mean, there's a lot of people in the. First off, you have to have the money to have a craftsman go in and make the tomb and do everything that needs to be done there. So yeah, everybody isn't going to have a tomb. It's just logically or logistically not going to work.
So somebody who was buried in a tomb, that would certainly show a social status, a
Absolutely.
distinction. Okay, so somebody who's buried in any kind of a tomb, whether it's a large catacomb or with many tombs, that would show that this person is
There's something there. It's a little bit
kind of an elite.
step up, right?
A step up to say, well, we're not just going to get buried out in the ground or out in this cemetery in the ground, but in a tomb.
Right.
But then Jesus, it's even more precious in that Joseph's tomb, and it was really an individual
Right.
tomb here.
Right. Absolutely.
And so that would be like the highest status.
I would assume so. I mean, it looks like it to me, and everybody around there had to kind of see it the same way. That's what they see every day, and that is how their lives function. So yes, that would be a definite symbol for them to see.
So the truth has been shown all along, even though this was all made for mockery, that God made it for the truth.
Oh,
I mean,
right.
even like on when Jesus was crucified, that there was a placard on his cross that said "King of the Jews."
Right.
They put that, the Romans put that up there to be a joke,
Right.
but really it's the truth. And
Right.
here, Jesus is buried in a king's tomb almost, so
Correct.
to speak. I mean,
Correct.
this is an elite thing. So.
Right.
Just when I'm sure the soldiers were saying, well, what do we do here now? I don't want to have to deal with this.
Yeah, and I think they were pretty much at that point ready to be done with. They've been through a lot, so I think they were ready to be done. So when they come up, or he comes up and offers to give them a tomb, they're probably more than happy to say, "Okay, this is your problem. Now we're done.
Yeah,
thank
good.
you. We've been through enough."
Yeah, so he's buried in Joseph's tomb. But then, they mention things like spices. Well,
Correct.
first of all, wrapped, and then spices in strips and linen. Yeah, I'm not trying to say, well, one goes before the other. I almost think that the spices would...
It's the spices come in a bathing process. So even the Jewish community today still does. They do a clean bathing normally by their own group of elders or whatever. But so yeah, he would have been bathed and cleaned up, and then the spices and the perfumes and the salts and things like that. Dignity, respect. Also, you got to think about, we're not embalming bodies back then, so some of it has to do with decomposition issues and things like that too. So those things are part of the normal process. And then yes, you'd be wrapped in linens before you were taken to the grave.
So that was what was proper then, and that's
Correct.
what happened with Jesus, is that they put the spices and wrapped him in the proper burial cloths, and then
Correct.
he was buried then in Joseph of Arimathea, who we then just assume, or we know he was a wealthy guy, but he's willing to give up his
Right.
tomb for Jesus. And
But
then-
he's a believer too.
yeah, it
You gotta
sounds like
remember
he
that.
was
He's
a
believer.
disciple.
Right.
A believer, and so here again, we don't always know who comes out of the woodwork at the last minute. I
No.
mean, when it comes to something like this, who are the believers? But then we'll continue on here, Jason.
Sure.
And here again, this is Jason Schumacher. He's a funeral director at Bear Funeral Home in Dubuque, and very interesting. I appreciate all of his knowledge and his background on this. So I'm going to read on just a little bit now in John chapter 20, and this is the resurrection, or this would have the resurrection account, but to begin with, it says, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So that's one of the things that Mary Magdalene here notices, is that the stone has been rolled away. So that was
Right.
part of the tomb too, is that you had actually like a big door.
Yeah, they would have a big door on there, a cover. I think they made sure this one was a little more secure than most, if we remember. They wanted to make sure that nobody was going in or out of there once they finally got Jesus in there. But yeah, to move the stone out, somebody's obviously been in or out of there. Obviously, we know out. But.
Yeah. And so now, when we look at Luke's account here, that as we look at Luke chapter 24, the first couple of verses here, on the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly two men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. Okay, well, aside from the angels that appeared, now this account shows that the women, who once again we would assume is Mary Magdalene and Mary and Joanna, that they're going to the tomb, but they have spices.
Right.
So now, okay, so Jesus died and was buried on a Friday, and so then you have the Sabbath, and now it's early on what would be the first day of the week, or Sunday morning, or what we now as Christians refer to as Easter morning, the resurrection of our Lord. But they were coming with spices. So now what was that all about?
Yeah, see, that part I'm not, maybe they went back, I'm not for sure on this, so don't hold me to this. But maybe the fact is they were coming back to maybe put a little more perfume or spices on to help cover up decomposition, again, would be my biggest guess. The other thing, though, we got to remember is the tomb was closed, so nobody was supposed to get in or out of there. So I don't know if they thought they were getting in, or if they were just going to anoint the grave or the tomb or something like that. I don't know the answer to that question.
Well, that's a good
I'm not sure
question.
why they were coming back the second time, other than if it was a repeated thing that you would do with the body, or my biggest thing is they weren't supposed to be able to get into the tomb. So maybe they're just going to bless the tomb. I'm not sure.
Because that tomb was guarded by Roman soldiers.
Correct.
I mean,
and a stone that man's not supposed to be able to move.
Yeah, so the weight of the stone, and then the soldiers who are guarding it.
With strict orders that nobody goes in there.
Yeah, so but that's probably one of the things that you notice when we're in grief.
Right.
That we're doing things that maybe are.
Right, and it could be easily them just going out to bless the grave or anoint the grave a little bit. I don't know. I mean, we all have to grieve, so that maybe that's their way of doing it. They just spent the day, I'm sure we're observing the Sabbath, that we're still pondering what has just happened. We're on the precipice of the new covenant being real now. It has to be, I mean, they're human too. We got to remember that they're human. We read about them and we're studying this like it's history, but these people all had things happening in their real life during that time. Just to be a little bit empathetic, that these are pretty troubling days. To be directly involved in this has to be a little much to handle. So maybe going out to the grave was one way they can kind of process this and work through it.
But it's interesting that Luke puts that in there, that they were going as grievers.
Right.
They weren't going there to expect to see Jesus risen.
No.
I mean, if anything, and they probably weren't even going there to expect to get into the grave.
Right.
But more the spices, that maybe there was some, either that they just felt like this is a way to show their love and respect. Like, I suppose maybe like for us to go to our loved ones' graves and put flowers.
Take flowers on it. Yeah, exactly like that.
Yeah. So, well, that's interesting. I never would have thought of that. I just always assumed that they were going there and they needed to get into the tomb and they needed to finish maybe some burial preparations that didn't get completed on Friday night, when really it probably just had to be like, a couple days after your loved one dies. Well, what do? You bring flowers. I mean, you anoint the grave with your tears. So yeah, well, that's very interesting.
I don't know if it's true. I wasn't there.
Yeah.
But
we're only trying to piece together, why this might have been, and so now, So just in kind of listening to you, you probably have already done most of this or have answered, kind of what I'm going to ask. But
that's okay.
If you're the funeral director at Jesus' burial, you know, this time which elapses, which wasn't a whole lot of time from the time that he dies on the cross until the time that he's buried in the tomb.
Right.
If you were the funeral director, you know, what are some things that I mean, obviously there are things that you would make sure would happen here.
Right. So obviously we'd have been following the same customs and laws that were already in place. So I think probably most of what they did would have been, if I'd have been involved, I'd have been doing probably the same exact things. It would have been a little bit of turmoil attached to it, obviously, with all the extra things going on around you. But I don't think, I mean, they tried to follow the normal customs the best that they could. So you have to kind of, that's one of our big things as funeral directors, is to try to help people and facilitate healing, and a lot of that is revolved around custom and tradition. They're following the custom and tradition of those times in that place.
So you would have been satisfied with everything to say, well,
I think so.
from the time that Jesus was taken down from the cross and the fact that he was anointed with the spices, wrapped in the burial cloths, and then buried in a tomb. The stone had been rolled in front of the tomb,
Right.
sealed, and even guarded to say, well, everything has been done to custom, and even honoring the Roman authority to say, well, we need to have this tomb protected.
Right.
That you could have left there saying, well, job well done.
We've done what we needed to do here.
Yeah.
Hopefully I would have been a believer, and I'd have been sad and happy at the same time, I suppose.
Been a believer that you would have been hanging around the first day of the week.
Right.
Yeah. On Sunday morning, you would have been there with the women. Well, very good. Well, that's why we go on Easter, don't we? And
Right.
well, hopefully every day that we say thank the Lord for this day and for the risen Christ, that we can celebrate every day. You know, I know Easter's always such a special,
Right.
special occasion where we just feel like we're right there with Mary Magdalene and Mary and Joanna and all the people that were there,
Right.
and even like Peter and John going into the tomb, and we want to be right there, but we are right there with them every day, aren't we, as
Right.
we believe in our Lord Jesus Christ.
Amen.
And so Jason Schumacher, funeral director at Bear Funeral Home in Dubuque, Iowa. Thank you, Jason, so much for being my guest today and to talk about the burial of Jesus. You've given us some very good insights.
Excellent.
And
Thank you.
I want to thank all of you for joining us this day as well.